Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the first of two to look at marine mammal conservation. What we're going to look at today is actually about harvesting marine mammals, so that's actually considered a fishery. So we'll look at some of the principles applied to managing fisheries and how they might be applied to marine mammals, including something called a maximum sustainable yield. And then we'll actually look at kind of a broader scope of just sustainable management practices and examples of cases where we haven't managed sustainably and what the outcomes have been. So we're going to go ahead and start with the idea of fisheries. Now, marine mammals, of course, are not a fish, but because marine mammals are harvested, sometimes purposely, so that's called commercial harvesting, and sometimes through what's called incidental take. Incidental take means that a fishery is not targeting marine mammals, but due to the technique that they use, they end up capturing a large number of marine mammals, or at least some marine mammals, as part of their fishing technique. And so we say that marine mammals are still included in these fishery policies. So when we refer to fisheries, we are including marine mammal stocks in that particular group. So, for example, the International Whaling Commission, which is responsible for global whaling activities, was first formulated actually as a way to manage global whaling fisheries. So marine mammals, of course, are still harvested, and there are many marine mammals that are not harvested regularly, but there's an interest or a renewed interest in harvesting them as a resource. So anytime you're looking at marine mammals and harvesting them, whether purposefully or incidentally, you always want to make sure that whatever you're doing is what's called sustainable. So sustainable fisheries are always the goal, and this includes all fisheries, but it applies to marine mammals as well. A sustainable fishery that is done for commercial principles is usually trying to maximize what a fishery can take. Take is another word for harvest, while also ensuring that the population is capable of replenishing itself fairly rapidly so that there's more the next year and the next year after that to be harvested. In other words, you don't want a population crash. So determining where you're actually going to set the level for how much fishing of a particular species can happen in a given time frame is a trade-off. Now, we'd like to say it was all based on science, but the realism of it is that it is a combination of the recommendation from science combined with politics. Yes, politics are a big deal when you are looking at fisheries because politics are involved in economics, and fisheries have a huge economic component. And then, of course, the interest of the fisheries themselves. Many fisheries have very powerful lobbyists that, again, therefore influence the politics and usually are on the opposite side of the recommendations from science. So you kind of have all of these in a mixing pot, and you kind of blend them together to come up with a magic number of what it's going to be. I'm not going to go too much into the politics or the lobbying interests, but what I do want to cover is some of the science. What science are we looking at for making recommendations? Now, historically and currently, probably the biggest number that we come up with is something called the maximum sustainable yield. When we are looking at the maximum sustainable yield, what we are interested in is what is the maximum number of individuals that a fishery can take in a given time frame. It's usually in a given year, but it could be in a given season, that would allow the fishery to profit the most while still making sure that the population has the ability to regrow very rapidly so that there's more for the next year and the next year and the next year. That's what's referred to as the sustainable part. So what we do is we start with the generic exponential population growth model that starts by going up, but then we say, okay, of course, there's some carrying capacity of the environment, so we have a leveling off. Now, if we actually look at this mathematically, the greatest slope is going to be right around here. So this is the maximum growth rate of the population. And in the 1930s, people actually said, okay, let's actually use the generic growth model to try to come up with some number of maximum sustainable yield. And what they came up with was about 50%. So maximum sustainable yield from a mathematical standpoint is going to be 50% of the carrying capacity. If you go higher than that, let's say 70% of carrying capacity, then you're not maximizing your take. If you go lower than that, then you might have an initial greater yield, but it's not going to be sustainable because the population grows more slowly. And so this is a relatively simple mathematical concept that has been used to manage fisheries since the 1930s and is still used heavily today. So interestingly enough, trying to actually come up with an MSY and employ it requires some additional considerations. First and foremost, you have to know what K is, or the carrying capacity of the environment, which is challenging to determine with confidence. Let me give you an example of why this might be. What is the carrying capacity of salmon in Washington? Well, in order to do that, you'd have to basically tell the fisheries to stop fishing. Nobody could disturb the fishery or the fish, and we'd have to get 10 years of data. That's not going to happen. So you have to use usually data before fishing happened, if there is any of that data. That's really difficult to get. And in many cases, the environment has changed so much that K has also changed as well. So very difficult to determine with confidence. And then moreover, because there is some political interest in fishing and getting the maximum yield out for any given year, many fisheries have not decided to set it at 50%, but actually set it at 30% of K. And of course, this puts you at risk of having a population crash. And the combination of not really knowing what K is, setting MSY to 30% or sometimes even lower, what we see is historically this MSY concept has been way too optimistic to sustainably manage many fisheries. One of the major reasons for this is because when you are applying the MSY principle, to apply it successfully, you actually need to know something about how that population reproduces. And it tends to work fairly well if the species are selected. Now, are selected means that you have rapid population growth. Each female can produce a ton of offspring, and therefore the population can rebound very, very quickly. Unfortunately, a lot of fish that are still managed under this MSY concept are not R-selected. This would include fish like sharks, and of course it includes all marine mammals. They are K-selected, which means their yearly population growth is going to be very slow. Therefore, when you have a K-selected species, it's rarely managed well under the MSY concept, mostly because human interests are not patient. In other words, humans are not willing to wait 10 years to open another fishing season for a particular dolphin, so to speak, or a shark, waiting for them to recover sustainably. You know, they work on yearly or sometimes seasonally fishing schedules, and so you expect the fish to be able to rebound on a yearly basis. And K-selected species simply don't work that way. So as we move away from just the idea of harvesting, let's actually talk about rules for sustainable management in general, whether or not you're trying to protect a species or manage them in terms of harvesting abilities. So I've basically outlined 3 rules that need to be upheld in order to achieve sustainable management, in other words, long-term sustaining population success. First and foremost, the removals from a population, again, whether by directly removing them because you're fishing them or indirectly removing them because of incidental catch, cannot be excessive. So this is going to be under the realm of the MSY concept. So again, maximum sustainable yields and what is the annual take of a particular species. But that's not the only thing that you need to be concerned about. You also need to be concerned about repopulation. In other words, you need to make sure that the birth rates and the survivorship of those offspring is maintained, or your population is going to crash. And third, and certainly not least important, you need to make sure that the ecosystem is going to be preserved. So a successful management technique is going to ensure all 3 of these, or at least try to ensure all 3 of these rules are preserved. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two examples of when they're not preserved. And I'm going to start with the terrible story of the Atlantic bluefin tuna, which is a case study in horribly managed fisheries. First and foremost, the MSY was not set to 50%. It is not set to 30%. It is set to 18% of K. And the realism is that the current population is around 3% of what it was in the 1960s. And in fact, the Southern Hemisphere Atlantic population is considered extinct. So what happened? Well, this is where politics and lobbying interests of fisheries kind of come into play. And in many cases, even if you do set a fishery schedule, monitoring it can be extraordinarily difficult, because how do you monitor the entire ocean to make sure that a fishing ship isn't coming in and taking fish when they're not supposed to? So you've got a lot of things at play here, but mostly you're looking at basically politics, where people were way too optimistic about how many bluefin tuna there would be. And, there's always more was kind of the mantra, and there wasn't always more. And so the population is functionally extinct in some areas, and in other areas, just over 3% of where they used to be. To compound matters, in 2010, we had the Deepwater Horizon explosion, which released a large amount of oil. It was a huge oil spill, and it oiled all the spawning eggs for that year, which means that no reproduction occurred for that year. So in the year 2010, not only was your MSY set way too low, but you also have criteria 2 and 3, reproductive success and the ecosystem preservation, not met as well. So 2010 was a year where all 3 criteria were failed to be met for the Atlantic bluefin tuna. Now, to move it to the marine mammals, because again, we don't really harvest too many marine mammal species, let's take a look at numbers 2 and 3 again for marine mammal preservation and management. So I'm actually going to use toxins as an example. Humans produced toxins, which are predominantly in the form of either hard metals like mercury or pesticides. So we use a lot of pesticides, particularly things that are called organochlorines. A famous one is DDT, which of course was responsible for the California condor decline. And we use these pesticides, or other countries use these pesticides, and then through the global cycling, they end up in the water column. So what happens is, because marine mammals are usually at the top, have a higher trophic level, they end up accumulating these organochlorines in their blubber layers, these organochlorines like lipids. So when you get an accumulation of these toxins, they end up interfering with certain physical or physiological properties, including your ability to use hormones effectively, and then also your immune system. So there's been a strong correlation between toxin level in the blubber and susceptibility to disease and low reproductive success. So when you have a large number of these toxins, not only do you have them, but if you're a mother and you're going to be lactating to your newborn calf or pup, all of that gets transferred into the milk. So almost immediately the calf or pup also gets a high level as well. And so in many species, the lack of reproductive success or the increased susceptibility to disease has been strongly indicated to be the cause of organochlorine accumulation in the blubber. So this again is another example of where we need to ensure reproductive success, and it's not always easy, and ecosystem health. And this is another example of where humans, through their use of pesticides, have actually made both reproductive success and ecosystem health more difficult than simply just saying or simply assuming that it's going to be all just fine as long as we don't fish them out. And with that, I will see you next time.